Thanks, Elle. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Head, and I am a staff attorney at Assista. I'll be moderating today's webinar with our esteemed panelists from our partner organizations. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on representing immigrant survivors during and post-COVID. Assista would like to thank the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women for their support of our training and technical assistance work. Without their generous support, today's webinar would not be possible. A few housekeeping matters. Today's webinar is being recorded. You should receive a link to the recording in the days after the webinar. You should have already received the slides and an index of the webinar materials prior to the webinar. Today's webinar has been approved for CLE credits in Texas. If you are barred in Texas, you should have included your bar number on your registration. But if you did not, please email Maria Lazzarino at manager@assistahelp.org after the webinar to get added to the list. If you are barred in a state other than Texas, please send Maria an email after the webinar and we will get you a certificate of attendance to submit on your own behalf. And like Elle said, if you have tech issues during the webinar, please put your question in the chat box and she can help you out. Next slide, please. So we're just going to start with an icebreaker today to get folks engaged. And the question is, if you could travel anywhere in the world, where would it be? And feel free to put your answer in the chat box. This all sound awesome. Morocco, I've always wanted to go there. Ireland. Awesome, really awesome choices. And how about my co-presenters? What do you all think?
I put mine in the chat. Thailand is definitely on my list.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Thailand's on my list as well, but I'm really excited to go to Jamaica.
I saw someone else put this too. Mine is Alaska. It's really hot in California right now, so I was just wanting a little bit of cooler weather.
Which part of California are you in?
I am in the Bay Area near Oakland, so it's actually not, too bad. But for us, like high 80s feels pretty warm. So
right, yeah, it makes sense. Okay, thanks everyone. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with introductions. Can my co-presenters introduce themselves and their agencies? Next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ayana Wallace, pronoun she, her, and I am the Training and Technical Assistance Manager with Ujima, Inc. And Ujima, Inc. is one of very few nationally designated culturally specific resource centers, along with my cousin resource centers here on the call with me. And our work at Ujima is to center the lived experiences, needs of Black women and girls and of the Black community as a whole. Next slide. And I'm just going to give a very quick overview of who we are, our mission and our vision. So our vision is to create a world where Black women and girls are valued, respected, safe, and free from violence. And our mission is to mobilize the community, to respond to and end violence at its intersections, and to serve as a resource to not only to survivors of violence, but for advocates, service providers, community members. So we're interested and we're invested in having conversations with hairstylists and barbers and folks that do community engagement work and folks that are community elders, law enforcement, faith communities, really everyone that's engaged and willing to do this work for Black women and girls. Next slide. And then we do have some specific areas of focus, including sexual violence, domestic violence, community violence, sex and labor trafficking, and institutional and structural violence as a whole. So really all the things and how they intersect in Black women and girls' lives and in Black communities' lives. And next slide, I think it's Shirley's turn.
Thank you, Ayana. Hi, everybody. My name is Shirley Liu, she, her pronouns. I'm a program manager with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. Similar to Ujima, we are a national resource center providing technical assistance, training, resource development, and research. Our focus is gender-based violence affecting Asian and Pacific Islander communities in the United States and its territories. So that includes areas of focus such as human trafficking, domestic violence, sexual assault, elder abuse, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Shows just a little bit more of what we do and what we address. Our vision is a world free of gender-based violence with equal opportunities for all communities to thrive. And we do this by working with our partners within Asian and Pacific Islander communities. A large part of them are community-based, culturally responsive organizations on the front lines working to support survivors on a daily basis. We also have national partners, state coalition partners, partners like Ujima and Esperanza United and Assista that we work with on a national level. And you can see some of our work on the right side. I think that's it for me.
And Paula, you can go ahead as well.
And I'll go next. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are calling from. My name is Paula Gomez Stordy, and I'm Senior Director of National Training and Technical Assistance at Esperanza United, formerly known as Casa de Esperanza. Esperanza United is a national resource center, Latino resource center, mobilizing Latina and Latino communities to end gender-based violence. We were founded in 1982 by 5 activist Latinas in response to hearing the community, and particularly Latina survivors of gender-based violence, saying that they were not receiving services, that there was nothing for them because of language access and because of the lack of culturally responsive programs. So now we work across the country providing training, technical assistance, as well as research, public policy, and out of St. Paul, Minnesota, we provide direct service, a refugio, which is a shelter, and also community engagement and family advocacy.
Thank you. And which communities do your organizations work with? Next slide, please.
So again, we at Ujima are centering Black girls and women, Black communities. But for us, it's really important that we underscore the Black community as not a monolith. And so when we're thinking about who encompasses the Black community, again, we understand that our definition even isn't an absolute and that we are not a monolithic people. We understand that there are a lot of assumptions made about when speaking about or when understanding the Black community. So we always seek to be fluid, inclusive, and embracing in our approach. The ways in which we currently define the Black community, we've sort of broken it up into different subgroups, which also helps us identify what folks' needs are. But we have African-American or Black American descendants of slaves. We have African or African immigrant, Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Latinx folks as well. And again, this is a broad start to defining the Black community. And there are a lot of other dynamics that we could talk through, and we will start to talk through when we get to intersectionality as well. But go ahead, Shirley.
So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the AAPI community, or the Asian and Pacific Islander community. And, of course, identity is something that's very complex. It's something that is largely self-determined. It's up to somebody whether they identify as AAPI or not. Not everybody from one of the backgrounds colored on this map might identify as AAPI, but we do like to use this map to show how much diversity and how much variance there is in this label. And similar to the Black community, the AAPI community is not a monolith. Sometimes we use the term AAPI or API. I think the new one now is AA and PI, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. There's also AA and HPI. There's, all sorts of different labels. But there's, just so huge in terms of diversity, in terms of ethnicities. As you can see from the map, you can imagine how many ethnicities are captured there. All the languages, in terms of religion, in terms of culture, the norms that those coming from these regions believe in, how these folks are coming to the US, whether as immigrants, whether as refugees, how recently they've come to the US, their education level, their economic standing, all this is highly varied within that label. And so, while it's useful to use these labels out of convenience, it does obscure the diversity of AAPI, the population, and some minority groups are invisibilized, unfortunately. For instance, the Pacific Islanders and the Southeast Asians, Indo-Caribbeans, and so on. And so it's important when working with a survivor or community to understand their individual background, rather than just kind of starting and ending with, well, this person's an AAPI person. That's all we need to know. And that's the root of survivor-centered advocacy, is understanding somebody's individual backgrounds and where they're coming from. And then Paula, I think, is next.
Thank you, Shirley. With Esperanza United, you may hear words such as Latino, right? We have a Latino network. When we say Latino, it's the origin of Latin America, right? So we're talking about geography. But when we say Hispanic, we're talking about language, the Spanish language. So a Hispanic may include someone from Spain, which is in Europe, but when we are speaking about Latinos, it's Latin America. In Latin America, we're representing 20 countries with Latin America and across the Caribbean. We are a very diverse community, as has been said by Shirley and Ayana. We have representing 20 countries with 20 different histories that are living across the United States and are living with different identities, right? And also the culture of where they are living is impacting their realities. And so we're working with individuals that may be a fifth generation that may not speak the language, but have live within the Latino culture. We're also working with individuals that may just recently have arrived to the US. And also we work with mainstream white organizations and communities as we're providing training in TA to support their capacity to increase their cultural responsiveness and language access.
Thanks, Paula. Next slide, please. Tell us about the barriers that your client populations have faced. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I think language is really important to all of us, and really delving into language, understanding the histories behind language, and really how it shows up as well is something that I think is important. So I wanted us to really think about how we can identify, how we can name anti-Blackness. And so anti-Blackness is defined, I like this definition because anti-Blackness is defined as being a two-part formation that basically voids Blackness of value while systematically marginalizing Black people and their issues. The first form of anti-Blackness is overt racism. Beneath that anti-Black overt racism is covert, structural, and systemic racism, which categorically predetermines the social economic status of Black people within a country. This structure is held in place by anti-Black policies, institutions, and ideologies. And the second form of anti-Blackness is the unethical disregard for anti-Black institutions and policies. So acting like it's not happening, ignoring it, not calling it out, not changing policies when you're able to. This disregard for the product, this disregard is really a product of class, race, gender privileges that certain folks have or have been granted due to, again, those anti-Black institutions and policies that have been set up. And this form of anti-Blackness is, again, really protected by the first form of anti-Blackness, which is overt racism. And so it's a cyclical process, it's a cyclical experience for Black people in any of those 4 subcategories that we talked about a little bit ago. So anti-Blackness is definitely an issue that comes up. Next slide. To even think about when anti-Blackness shows up in organizational spaces, and it might show up in different structural spaces that we're in individual relationships like microaggressions, people experiencing anti-Blackness as a microaggression. We really have to think about what survivors might experience then. So an example that comes up when we talk about immigration is anti-Blackness in the immigration system. So thinking about even when anti-Blackness isn't specifically named in a policy, how it might show up in practice. So on the other side of that immigration is a Black issue picture is an image. The bottom image is of some Haitian refugees basically being rounded up at the border by folks on horseback with ropes, which is very much reminiscent of slave era days. And so to think about how, even if it's not written into policy to be anti-Black necessarily, how it might show up in different spaces. Similarly, when folks are in shelter spaces and there are anti-Black policies where it might have to do with hair or hygiene, where it's not specifically calling out race, but it's absolutely directed to a racial category or people. Next slide. And then we have misogynoir, which for us at Ujima is really important to hone in on as well. So misogynoir is a term that was coined by queer Black feminist and scholar and professor Moya Bailey back in 2010 to describe the specific ways in which racism and misogyny combine to oppress Black women. So the way in which I think about misogynoir is what happens when misogyny and Black womanhood collide. What are the ripples? What are the impacts? What are the outcomes for survivors or just people generally? So an example of misogynoir that comes to mind for me is Don Imus back in 2004, feeling entitled enough to call the Black women on the Rutgers basketball team nappy-headed hoes on live radio. It's the constant and still very ongoing attacks of former First Lady Michelle Obama, who was called everything from ugly to classless to ghetto to mannish to uneducated, even though she is one of the most educated First Ladies we've had in our history. It's the removal or erasure of Tarana Burke, who was the founder of the Me Too movement, from magazine covers, from public discourse. It's Marissa Alexander being sentenced to 20 years initially for firing a warning shot, not even at her abusive partner, but in the same vicinity as him. It's the fact that Black women still don't have basic rights, like how we can wear our hair, which is why we have legislation being promoted now, like the Crown Act, that is supposed to protect natural hair in the workplace, because that's how misogynoir shows up, right? And so to think about how that might translate to other communities, right? So we talk about Afro-Latino folks, they're part of the Black community, part of the Latinx community, thinking about the intersections there. I could go down a whole tangent, but these are just some of the issues that come up. And I know that, you know, my cousins here on the call can speak to a lot of the other issues, but really thinking about then how might something simple like ethnicity, or how you show up in a space, or how visually you show up in a space, how that's connected to the immigration system or service provision just across the board. Next slide. And then some really important narratives or tropes that we need to name in order to also reframe a lot of the current narratives about Black women are a result, or really from the lineage of slavery or the slave eras. So I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly, but reach out to me if you want a further breakdown, we can always talk it through. So the myth of the matriarch, the overbearing matriarch, the mammy, and the Jezebel all came directly out of the slave eras. The matriarch was seen as overbearing, drove men away, was a workhorse, could reproduce, but wasn't desirable. We then have the mammy, always think of Shirley Temple era, but she's really seen as like the happy slave, loved to serve, happy with her station in life, and was generally seen as asexual. And for that reason, she was put in charge of breastfeeding the plantation owners' babies before she was allowed to breastfeed her own. She was the wet nurse. And then we have the Jezebel, who is actually hypersexualized, seen as sexually available and indiscriminate, flirtatious. And so whatever physical or sexual violence is enacted upon her body, she deserved it because she was too wanton, too loose. Then we have the Sapphire, the Black Superwoman, the Welfare Queen, and the Angry Bitter Black Woman. Well, really, let's hold on that last one. But the Welfare Queen, Sapphire, and Black Superwoman all came closer to the Civil Rights Movement and the war on drugs. The Welfare Queen was seen as lazy, scamming the system, doesn't want to work, but wants to keep having a whole bunch of kids. The Sapphire, she's really the neo-Jezebel image. She's seen as loud, angry, exploits men for money. This is where the gold digger trope comes from. And then we have the Black Superwoman, which is seemingly from this list the most positive. She will, she wants to do it all. She'll make it happen. She'll figure it out. She's really strong. Again, seemingly the most positive, but incredibly limiting, because then Black women aren't seen as vulnerable. Black women aren't seen as needing help or deserving help or worthy victims, right? And then the main overarching trope that exists is the angry, bitter Black woman, which can be applied really at any point, any time. If a Black woman disagrees, or she's not smiling, or she just has a different opinion, it's very common that Black women are called angry and bitter as a way to shut us down from telling our stories. And so I wanted to really make sure we name these narratives and think about, if it's applied to Black women generally, what are some of the other intersections, which again, we're going to talk about, what are some of the other intersections that might also shape their narrative or their experience? Next slide. Okay, and this is where Shirley and Paula, please feel free to help me add to this conversation and navigate this. But I wanted us to, in the chat, quickly think about and add your comments. If we were to draw out or create or design the archetype of the norm, so the most normalized person in our society, what would that person look like? How would they show up in society? What privileges might they experience? So go ahead and put it in the chat, and I'll name out a couple things folks usually say. So we usually say the most normalized person is white, male, cisgendered, what else? Middle class, what else? Able-bodied, you see straight, tall, Protestant or Christian at least, college educated, 30 to 50, English speaking and generally without an accent, or we know that some accents are seen as more acceptable than others, right? Part of the patriarchy, seen as neurotypical. What else? I saw college educated. What else? What else is there? US citizen, or has valid documentation, able-bodied, rich or wealthy, never been to jail, never used drugs, maybe not conservative attire, but at least has the wealth to afford nice clothes. Healthy, right? So having access, social skills, access for networking, acculturated, yes. And so as we keep going, the box gets more and more and more narrow. Nuclear family, that's a great point. The box gets more and more narrow on who's seen as the norm versus who's seen as the other. Because we know that the farther removed from being seen the norm you are, the more othered you are, the more marginalized your experience becomes. And so if we know that all of those things are the norm, how do we continue knowing that? Through what? Through what type of things? Media, school, right? So like we're informed by all those different isms that exist in society, right? So if you look at this chart, or you look at this infographic, it's really that second ring or that darker green ring from the middle. So racism, discrimination, ableism, homophobia, heterosexism, sexism, all these other isms that we could name, that's really what keeps us knowing who's the norm and who's not, right? And so to think about then, what are folks' relationships to different systems? If you are an Indian immigrant that has a disability, that is trans, what is your experience gonna be in the legal system? That's important to talk about. What has your experience been with colonialism? That's important to talk about. And so I'm gonna pass it because I know I've been talking, but I really want us to, again, as we're going through this conversation, make sure that we're delving into identity and intersections for folks, and then how folks based on multiple identities are going to navigate different systems. And next slide.
So I'm so glad that Ayana just shared that visual and that she went right before me, because it just so perfectly captures, I think, the wholeness of somebody's identity, the wholeness of somebody's background and experience, all these different aspects of what makes someone who they are, and how these experiences, these identities, might impact how they respond to violence, how they respond to help, how they respond to support, the decisions that they make, the decisions that they have, the decisions that they feel like they have to make, or the decisions that they feel like are out of their reach. Within the AAPI community, again, there's a huge diversity in terms of historical experience and background, but some of what we've seen in the AAPI community that's part of that, the rings, the wheel that Ayana just showed, generational trauma, right, and historical trauma that this person or their family experienced back in the home country. For instance, Vietnamese refugees or Hmong or Laotian refugees who've come in the middle of the last century, fleeing state violence, fleeing civil war in their home countries. Many of them were resettled in refugee camps in the US or other countries before they had come here. Many of them experienced more violence in those camps, state violence, sexual violence in those camps before coming here. That all makes up part of their identity today. Or just last fall, right, what happened in Afghanistan, creating thousands of refugees coming to the US that are still in the process of being resettled, that are still not, on their feet yet, so to speak, who still have family back in Afghanistan that they're waiting to be reunited by. For Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, historical trauma includes obviously colonization of their ancestral lands, which can be deeply disruptive to cultures that place such a high emphasis and meaning behind the land, behind the sea, the physical land space. Being connected to this land can be deeply meaningful to some communities and some cultures. This experience also includes not being able to speak their language, being publicly beaten, publicly shamed as kids in school for speaking their native, for speaking their language, for not being able to practice their culture or their religion, for being forcibly assimilated into the US, the norms, forcibly trying to be pigeonholed into the norm that we just talked about. All of this has left deep scars in communities where things like how to be in a healthy relationship, how to communicate with the family, these are all things that are supposed to be passed from generation to generation, from the elders to the younger generations. And because of these disruptions, that's not, hasn't been able to happen in the same degree. And instead, what we have being perpetuated in many cases is the cycle of violence. Separate or on top of all of that, for immigrants who are experiencing violence in their relationship, the batterer or abuser often uses immigration status as a tool of abuse. So taking away somebody's documents, purposely letting their status lapse, purposefully not filing paperwork threatening them with deportation, saying, I'm going to report you to ICE, whether or not that person is here legally, whether or not they have status, the threat, can still be made and can still be very effective. It all serves to keep that person, the survivor, in a constant state of fear and dependency upon the abuser. And we've seen many cases where somebody would rather stay in the abusive relationship than report it to the police, because they're afraid that if they report it to the police is going to report it to immigration detention or what have you. They're going to get their kids taken away. They're going to get sent home to their home country, their kids being here and separated from them. In many cases, family members are still in the home country, parents, grandparents, uncles, and there's been many cases where a marriage happens under false pretenses. So for instance, somebody is already married here, they don't tell their new partner. Sometimes a very young girl is engaged to a much older man. She isn't aware of how old he is. She may not be aware that he's already married and has kids. One spouse might bring their partner to the home country, supposedly on vacation. Once they're there, take away all the documents, all the passports, take away the flight tickets, and leave that person basically stranded in the home country with no way to get back to the US and no way to get back to any children if they have children here in the US. There's also been many cases where a marriage is a cultural or spiritual marriage, and so that's not recognized legally in the United States, which leaves parties, which leaves the people in that marriage without legal standing, without grounds for claims, and so on. So all of these things are just some things that we've seen often in AAPI. In the AAPI immigrant community. A lot of these cases can be very complex. They require a lot of, careful and tailored advocacy to be able to respond to. Next slide, I just have one more, yeah. And so as far as some of the barriers that arise from systems, COVID has made everything so much harder. It has made everything take so much longer, including the immigration system. There were already long processing times for status and services. We already have known survivors who have waited decades for status, and now it's become so much worse with just the backlog of processing. And for survivors, this means that their cases are in limbo. They're not able to access safety. They're not able to access financial stability. Maybe they're not able to work because they don't have the right status. And that can leave somebody further dependent upon an abusive partner if they're not able to get on their own feet. Or qualify for benefits, certain services, and so on. And secondly, we always come back to language access as one of the top issues across the board for survivor access, not just in the immigration realm, but just across the board. I know we will talk about language access more a little bit later, but just to name that there's, in the AAPI community, there's over 70 languages and dialects. And on top of that, not everybody may be literate. And so that means that information that's coming out from from wherever, systems, offices, and so on, from the government, most of that's only available in English. Often it's English, Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, a handful of top languages, but there's so many languages that are not being included there. And what that does is it leaves certain people out of the loop. They're not able to get the information that they need to make the informed choices they need to make for themselves and their families in the same way that English speakers can. Lastly, for many AAPI communities, the family goes beyond the nuclear family, and a household might consist of, grandparents, uncles, cousins, and so on. And so that makes it harder for some families and some family members to qualify for certain pathways to immigration or certain services and benefits because they don't count as immediate family in the same way that the US system defines the narrow definition of family, which can be very complicated and difficult barrier. Lastly, I just want to point out that our immigration system in the US is so complicated. I'm sure many of you are immigration attorneys, and you've seen the paperwork, you've seen the bills that come out. It's so full of legalese, it's so full of nuances and details, and it changes so frequently depending on the administration. It's overwhelming, right? You can't expect somebody who is newly immigrated to the US, somebody who might only speak a little bit of English, somebody who has potentially been in a traumatic situation or are still in an abusive situation, to understand our system and all what their options are in each situation. And that's a huge barrier in and of itself, is the full, like, overwhelming nature of our immigration system, and our other systems too. That creates so much uncertainty and fear, and those can become huge barriers to access. Next.
And Paula?
Yeah, thank you, Shirley and Ayana. Literally everything that Shirley and Ayana said applies to the Latino community in terms of anti-Blackness, anti-immigrant sentiments and how they impact the community. So when Ayana asked the question, who is the most normal person that would have resources, like the basic normal? And we put all of those words on the chat. That is typically how our institutions are created to serve survivors of violence with that lens. And so the vision or the thought of not having cultural differences as a option or as a reality makes us not have really inclusive programming. And so it takes more than translating a brochure. It takes really looking at the infrastructure of the organization, the representation of the community within the organization, meaningful collaborations or MOUs, right? Not only with culturally specific organizations, but with the but with the communities within the service area. And so that's a barrier if someone comes in and there's not a language access plan that the organization has, or there isn't an understanding of all these issues that were just stated by Ayana and Shirley. So one thing that I would add or give more examples is the trauma experienced here within the United States, within communities that we've spoken about, and also the trauma of the country of origin, and that there's similar histories than in the United States, histories of colonization that include genocide and that include enslavement. And so those structures of oppression still exist in the countries of origin as well as experienced here. And so if there was political warfare in the country of origin and someone with a uniform shows up to ask for a loved one, and then we don't see that loved one ever again, that uniform represents that trauma and fear in this country. And so understanding when we're speaking to individuals to not only see what has happened that brought them to us, but what is the history of trauma that they may face. I also wanted to add that acculturation is the process of learning a new culture. And that is a process. We see that children are more acculturated. They learn the new culture faster in the language. Just because someone speaks English, is able to speak, doesn't mean they're fully acculturated. That impacts their ability to navigate systems, navigate norms. And on top of that, they're experiencing violence. Just a quick example, my family lives in Chile, I live here. A quick example of acculturation. I was in the supermarket, and in the supermarket, you have to weigh your tomatoes, let's say your produce, and then you have to put a sticker. I didn't know that because when I go to the supermarket, they already scan it. I didn't know that. So I was waiting and the line was waiting and I was horrified because I didn't know that. I speak Spanish fluently. It's, I guess, my first language, but I didn't know that. When we went to get an Uber to go home, the Uber wasn't working, so we got a taxi. My little cousin knew that because I live in the States, says there's a guy that's gonna put our bags in the taxi. You're supposed to give him a coin. I said, oh, thank you. If I didn't know that I had to give the guy a coin, you would have thought, oh, wow, she's cheap. Like I did all this and she didn't give me. So all those cultural differences, those nuances impact the way we seek services and see the violence that is occurring to us.
How has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted AAPI, Black and Latina immigrant survivors? Next slide, please.
That's me. So as far as COVID-related impacts that we've witnessed in the AAPI community, we know that many AAPI folks have come to the US on work visas. And we know that even though there's that model minority myth, you know, all AAPIs work in tech, all AAPIs are well off, or, you know, they're doctors, they work for Google or Apple or whatever. We on the contrary, we know that AAPI women especially are overrepresented on both the frontline and low wage workforces. So jobs like restaurant staff, nail salon, hair salon, retail, personal care aides and personal care assistants. And recent studies have shown that long-term unemployment has affected the AAPI community harder than many other communities. More AAPI folks have lost employment in the longer term than others. And so that means that many of them may have faced the loss of immigration status because they're not able to work if they were here on a work visa. Secondly, as many courts have started switching to virtual hearings and interviews, that's created a lot of fear in the community around confidentiality and privacy. Not everybody has a same level of comfort and familiarity with technology, with Zoom, with the internet, and so on. And not everybody has access to a safe computer or a safe network. Not everybody relatedly can use the standard features that are available, and many folks need accessibility features, captioning or interpretation, of course, to start with, but potentially other features, other things such as, you know, color contrast, font sizes, stylistic choices, and so on. For instance, I think this is still true that the Zoom chat only allows the Roman alphabet, the ABCD alphabet. It doesn't allow characters like Chinese characters, Japanese, Arabic, and so on. I think that's still true. And so often cases, folks who are trying to communicate in those languages have adapted. So what we've seen is sometimes they pull up like a Google document. They share that Google document with the whole group that's on the meeting. And on Google Docs, they can type in, you know, with characters. So instead of using the Zoom chat, they'll do that. But it's just an additional step that some folks have to do. And then other folks, you know, just automatically can do because they speak English, or they speak, or they can communicate with the Roman alphabet. And what our system does is it puts the burden on the person, the client, or the survivor to ask for access and ask for accommodations. And not everybody knows how to do that or is comfortable doing that. On the next slide, you'll just see like a illustration of what I spoke about. Just a little bit of data showing that, you know, the long-term or the unemployment that's been seen as a result of COVID. And again, job loss not only can impact the immediate immigration status, but also somebody's ability to show up to court if they're able to get transportation. whether they can show up to a service agency, whether they can find childcare or even put food on the table for their families, and so on. Yeah, I don't know if Ayana or Paula wanted to weigh in there, but I'll pass it to someone else now.
I just had probably I'm gonna try to keep it quick, two quick things. So the first thing that resonated with me from the last slide is really thinking about when folks shifted to virtual service provision, virtual judiciary, settings, that a lot of bias came up that folks were not expecting. So like Shirley's point, whatever's happening in the background, it's not just in the background, like it's going to seep into folks' perceptions or folks' bias. Quick example, my future husband is Haitian, very loud Haitian household, like everybody talks at full volume and with their hands. And so they might be having a simple conversation. It seems really loud, it seems like arguing. If I'm on a training and folks are hearing that, or I'm on a court proceeding and folks are hearing that, they're gonna make assumptions or they're gonna make judgments. Similarly, another point is that what COVID really highlighted, and I think for all of our resource centers, is that these issues are not just part of the pandemic. Like all of these issues are really endemic for us. Like they've been existing for us. COVID just highlighted them a little bit more. And so I think really, again, when we talk about intersectionality, when we talk about the relationship with systems, it's that much more important to really lean into folks' intersectional identities so that you're not filling the gaps, basically. Like we really have to understand who people are as whole people to understand what their specific needs are, not just generally like what Black people's needs are, because that's too general, that's too broad. There's so many ways to be. And so my needs are gonna be different from a Nigerian trans woman's needs, for example. So to really hone in on that and really think about, again, how do we fill resources or how do we fill gaps with resources for folks, especially during times where folks are losing their job. And, we already know how difficult it is for survivors that are underemployed or don't have employment or don't have stable housing or don't have stable access to food, how difficult their process can already be. So yeah, let me pass it on.
Just wanted to add,
I was going to say we can go to the next slide so Paula can weigh in as well.
thank you. I wanted to add with Ayana's point about the video, the conferencing, that also was not safe for some survivors, right? And so as programs transition to home, whether it was on a laptop, whether it was on a phone, there are people and there's behind us and there's some things that can't be said. So going from in person to video. So when survivors were able, they had to leave the house to get on the phone to talk, but that video also impacted confidentiality and safety. In terms of, as we've heard, domestic violence and sexual assault, it increased the isolation that survivors experience, because we know that violence is perpetuated when someone is isolated. And so if you think of all these barriers that were already mentioned, there's isolation, there's a lack of access. On top of that, maybe language. And now there is this mandate for social distancing. What we found is that there are a lot of things, a lot of information at the beginning was not really accessible in other languages. It had to be, and when it was, if you go to the CDC page, it's all in Spanish. However, it's not really digestible. It's literally translated from English to Spanish. And so, yes, there was translation after, but then there was a lack of cultural responsiveness and readiness in terms of reaching the community. Some of the best practices for health were not possible for the Latino community. If Latinos were living in an urban area, They had to take the elevator or take the stairs if they're living in a building or a brownstone. They can't, when they're going to get their mail, they have to be with other folks. If they live in rural communities, they did not have access readily available for COVID testing or vaccines. And so there's a diversity in the community, but they are the population that had to really not stop working. They had to show up or lose their jobs and financially impacted by that. The court proceedings, it was in an emergency mode. They were backed up. A lot of courts did not have language access. Some did, but there was not enough. Even within hospitals, right now I'm calling from Boston, Massachusetts. We have teaching large hospitals. The hospitals had language lines because all of their interpreters were on the floor. And so that was another barrier. Before COVID, survivors could have some refuge in a emergency room, even for a night, or have some services within a clinic or within a hospital. With COVID, they had to be there was a quick turnaround of getting people out. So there was another institution that was not readily available to them. And next slide, please. As I mentioned, confidentiality issues and safety issues. What did increase was the stalking and harassment, and through phone and social media. Before logging on, we were all talking about WhatsApp. WhatsApp is an application similar to texting that is very much used internationally. And so it is free, it's encrypted, and you can show pictures or videos, and also voice messaging. We heard from many communities that there was an increase in threats, or controlled, if I don't want you to leave the house because you're going to get COVID, and then you're going to make me sick. So again, using COVID and using this isolation as a tool to further abuse. Next slide goes to Shirley.
So what suggestions does your organization have for navigating immigrant survivor representation during COVID-19, particularly difficulties obtaining required documents and applying for family members who are living abroad? Next slide, please.
Yeah, so all of our systems, just like all of us, have been impacted by COVID and all of the ripple effects that COVID has created. And all systems are different, so there's no single answer. Our suggestion would be to get in touch with other attorneys, other service providers that are supporting survivors in your area, and to find somebody who's working within the system and have a conversation with these people. Find out where that backlog in that particular system is, and co-design mechanisms and ways to address these backlogs in the way that makes sense for immigrant survivors. You can also contact your congressional office to ask for congressional support. There's staff in each congressional office that's supposed to be there for constituent support. Bring the issue to their attention. It's not lobbying, it's a built-in mechanism that's available for constituents. Essentially, it's systems advocacy in partnership with other service providers in your area. And we are, big fans, big proponents of systems advocacy, bringing the needs of survivors and of communities to the systems level to show the impact. And it obviously is not an easy process and does not come free of pushback or complications, but it can be a powerful tool. And then in the meantime, for the clients who are stuck waiting for documents, keep that line of communication open with them, keep them updated on why there's a delay, what they might expect, what's going on, and so on. There's just so much fear and anxiety for the client, for the survivor through this whole process, especially for somebody who's in crisis, who is in an abusive relationship. And even for those who aren't, it's an incredibly stress-inducing process. it's important to be attentive to how to lessen that anxiety and that stress for those who are going through it. Part of that is being transparent, making sure that they are informed throughout the process with the information they need. Next.
Thanks, Shirley. I'm just going to speak a little bit about this issue as well. My first piece of advice is, to the extent possible, don't wait until the last minute to start this process of document gathering, especially given age out issues like for I-929 derivative children who don't have age out protection by statute. You want to be giving yourself and the client as much time as possible to gather evidence. Allowing sufficient time helps build trust with the client by alleviating the stress and anxiety associated with the immigration process. And building trust is a really important part of establishing that trauma-informed relationship. It's really important to document all of your efforts to obtain documents. So all of your contacts to embassies, consulates, government agencies. You want to be keeping a written record of this with dates, times, names of people you spoke with, and what was said on the call. That said, it's important, if possible, to try to do most of this communication in writing, because that way you actually have a paper trail, you have the actual emails back and forth with the agency, you have letters sent to the agency, and then you'll be submitting the record of communications and the efforts to obtain the documents to the decision maker, either USCIS or the Department of State. Having sufficient evidence and details helps enhance the client's credibility. One thing I will say about that, though, is that remember that counsel's arguments are not considered evidence in immigration cases. So what does this mean? Say, for example, you contacted the Marriage Bureau 6 times to try to get the client's marriage license and you weren't able to obtain it. I'm just saying in your brief that you contacted them many times and you couldn't obtain the document. That's not considered evidence. You need, for example, a sworn statement that details all of your efforts to obtain the evidence. And that's why, to the extent possible, it's helpful to have the written record of communications, because then you can just submit those to the immigration system and that would be considered evidence. Communicate through multiple channels. Don't use just one channel of communication. Even if it takes a while to reach a human being, don't give up. Try, if it's a consular processing issue, the immigrant or non-immigrant visa section's email address that's typically on the embassy or consulate's website. You can use the ask nvc@state.gov email address if that's appropriate. Check the embassy's information on how to submit an expedite request, which might be necessary, for example, if there's an imminent age out or some sort of an emergency situation. And like Shirley was saying, working with congressional liaisons can be helpful. Sometimes that can help get cases unstuck. There is a practice pointer in your materials about getting in contact with your client's congressional representative. So I encourage all of you to take a look at that. For clients who are living abroad, another option with the client's permission is to contact the consulate of the client's home country in the United States. So say the client is from Brazil, you can contact the Brazilian consulate to get information about how the client could obtain a document outside of the United States. And you'd also be asking if there's any COVID restrictions on the ability to obtain the document. And if there are, it would be ideal to get written confirmation of that so that you could submit that to the decision maker. But if not, making sure that you are keeping a record of who you've spoken with and what the contents are of that call. Working with culturally competent advocates can be really helpful in these situations because they can help the client communicate with government agencies. They might be able to accompany the client to appointments. They can work with the client on their life history and developing possible sources of secondary evidence that can prove, for example, a relationship if the client isn't able to get primary evidence. And just they can help ease the client's mind and not feel quite as alone in this really complex process that is our immigration system. Of course, make sure you're researching your state law and attorney-client privilege and how working with advocates can impact that privilege. The next piece of advice is that In U visa and VAWA cases, when you're having these documentation problems with USCIS, make sure that you're always invoking the any credible evidence standard. Remember that for U visas and VAWA self-petitioning children and spouses, that's a statutory standard, which means it's in the congressional statute, and it should be superseding any regulations or form instructions that are to the contrary. Do be aware of the procedure to demonstrate primary and secondary evidence is unavailable. It's at the 8 CFR regulation that's highlighted here on your screen. For U visa cases, if you want your client's case approved at the USCIS level without an appeal, if possible, try to follow the process at the regulation because the form instructions for the I-918 do require it. But as a backup or in the alternative, you could also argue that this process shouldn't actually be required at all because of the any credible evidence standard, which is in the statute and thus, is superior to the regulation. You can also analogize to the virtue memo, which is also in your materials. That is about VAWA self-petition cases, but it does say that VAWA self-petitioners not being required to demonstrate that primary or secondary evidence is unavailable is derived from the any credible evidence statute. And if you look at the text of the VAWA any credible evidence statute and the U visa statute, you'll see that it's very similar. So you could use the virtue memo also to analogize and argue that you shouldn't even have to follow the process in the regulation. The same regulation that's listed in your slide, Section 3 of it also specifically states for VAWA cases where the self-petitioner is a spouse or a child who's been abused by a qualifying relative, they're actually not required to demonstrate that primary or secondary evidence is unavailable. So this can be really helpful for cases when, for example, there's a COVID-related issue with getting a document. When you look at the text of the regulation, you'll notice that it doesn't mention self-petitioning parents, but self-petitioning parents, according to footnote number 9 of chapter 2 of the new VAWA sections of the policy manual, does say that USCIS's interpretation of this regulation is that it also includes self-petitioning parents. So to the extent you have a VAWA self-petition case where it's a self-petitioning parent and you're unable to get certain documentation, make sure you're citing that footnote in your cover letter or your memo. Clarify that this is the agency's interpretation of the regulation and that they need to be following it. Something else that's really helpful, particularly for VAWA self-petition cases, is that the virtue memo, as well as the VAWA part of the policy manual, mention that a VAWA self-petition case cannot be denied due to failure to submit a particular piece of evidence. And this is really critical for these cases when a client is not able to obtain a certain document, like for example, because of COVID-related issues. Your client should of course be explaining in their declaration why they don't have the evidence, and you should be submitting evidence of efforts to obtain the document. But it's also important to make sure that in your cover letter or brief, you're citing these sources of agency policy and arguing that, under USCIS policy, this case can't be denied just because the client doesn't have this piece of evidence, and that USCIS needs to be following their own policy. And in all cases, of course, the evidence that you submit needs to be consistent with other pieces of evidence that you've already submitted in the case, as well as external information, like for example, information in DHS databases. And to the extent there are inconsistencies, you want to make sure that you're explaining them up front in the client's statement, rather than waiting for an RFE from USCIS. And the reason I say this is because it's a lot harder to rehabilitate credibility later on than it is to explain inconsistencies up front. And credibility is really important in these cases where the only evidence you might have, for example, of a relationship is the client's own statement. And in all of your cases, of course, you need to be showing why the alternative evidence you've provided is credible. While the standard is incredible evidence and USCIS needs to be held to that, you do need to show, of course, that it is credible. So just always make sure you're doing that. Regarding Department of State cases, you should be looking at the immigrant and non-immigrant visa regulations. They start at 22 CFR and they're cited in your slide. Under both the immigrant and non-immigrant regulations, they both state that the consular officer shall consider any evidence that the non-citizen presents. So that's really important if, for example, your client is going to a consular interview without, for example, a birth certificate, that the client is also bringing some sort of a brief or a memo from you that cites this regulatory provision, that the DOS needs to be considering all of the evidence that they bring. The regulations also have a standard for when a document will be considered unobtainable, and it's the same standard for immigrants and non-immigrants. And that is if the document cannot be procured without causing the applicant or a member of the applicant's family actual hardship as distinct from normal delay and inconvenience. And again, you could look at the regulation for that language, and you should be using that standard to frame arguments that a certain document, for example, in a consular processing case, is unavailable. And when you're arguing that evidence is unavailable for Department of State purposes, again, just like you would for a USCIS case, make sure you're submitting evidence that the document is unobtainable. So for example, if you talk to the consulate at the client's for the client's home country and they said, well, this is not available due to COVID, make sure you're submitting evidence of that unavailability, like a letter from the consulate or a sworn statement about the phone conversation. And then if a document is deemed unobtainable, again, this is in the regulation, the consular officer may consider alternative evidence if the officer is satisfied that the evidence is considered satisfactory. So you'll need to be arguing why, for example, an alternative document to prove a relationship should be considered satisfactory. And you could consider making similar arguments that you would make as to why a document is credible, for example, for USCIS purposes. And in both immigrant and non-immigrant visa cases, you can also consider DNA testing if it's requested to prove a specific relationship. The Department of State website has some helpful information on DNA testing, and the organization Clinic also has some FAQs about DNA testing on the resources portion of their website under family-based immigration. So that's a really helpful resource I would encourage folks to take a look at. And finally, those of you who are LAV grantees and subgrantees, as well as STOP subgrantees, you have free access to technical assistance from ASISTA as long as the client's immigration case is either based on or related to or arising from domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. So to the extent that your client's case falls into one of those categories and you are having issues either with the consulate or with documentation, please feel free to contact ASISTA for technical assistance, and we can try to help you work through the issue and brainstorm some solutions. Next slide, please. How can practitioners develop a trauma-informed relationship with advocates during and after COVID-19?
I can go first. If Ayana, this was for Ayana, Shirley, and I, Kelly?
It is, yes, I'm
Okay.
sorry. The rest of them are for all three of you.
Okay. So as mentioned, so let me back up. I was gonna, trauma informed is used a lot in trauma informed practices and so forth. And sometimes I realize that different people mean different things when we're talking about trauma informed. But in a nutshell, what trauma informed is understanding the impact that a traumatic event has on the brain and body. Just that, right? that trauma impacts the brain, it impacts memory, it impacts the body, it impacts speech. And so understanding that that event is going to have an impact. And then when that has an impact on the individual, communicating is going to be different depending on how that is impacted. And so understanding, we describe the different ways in which individuals are impacted, depending if it's urban, if it's rural, right, or the country of origin, histories and how they've experienced COVID and where they are living, if it's a multi-generational home. All of those experiences are going to impact the individual. So having an understanding of the individual in front of us, because there's not one Latino, one Black, one Asian experience. So understanding and being trauma informed is responding to the individual in front of us, right? Which we need humility, right, for the individual to guide us on what their reality is. I would say that would be an approach, is to start that relationship, just asking questions, getting to know someone. Sometimes it may be intimidating just because someone is behind a desk with a screen typing is very intimidating. Depending on what the person history has been. So just having a, maybe in a conference room or a cup of coffee at a coffee shop, just having just time to get to know the person is really going to make it easier then to gather information and communicate with the individual.
Yeah, I would just add that folks, especially during this time and after COVID, which after COVID can mean a lot of different things, but I think it's really important for folks to, one, lean into their empathy and really make sure that they're aware of how secondary trauma is showing up in their body or in their advocacy. And also, I really liked what Paula said about just staying culturally humble, because we saw it even in the Black communities where there are a lot of assumptions or biases made, or, assumptions made about folks and why they weren't getting the vaccine, or a lot of judgments made about folks and why they weren't getting the vaccine. And folks were really writing off Black people's, all of our experience, but Black people's experience with the healthcare system and with trusting different institutions with our bodies and with access even, and like what access looks like for different communities to begin with. And so again, just really lean into your empathy and remain culturally humble and be willing to be creative and get creative with some of these solutions we're going to have to find.
Thanks, Ayana. Shirley, did you have anything?
No, not at this moment. I think Ayana and Paula have covered it very well.
Great. Next slide, please. How have racism and harmful stereotypes affected immigrant survivors, particularly during COVID-19? Next slide, please.
So as you can see from that statistic that's up on the screen, there's been a huge increase in harassment incidents reported by AAPI community members from the beginning of COVID, essentially. And this data is from June 2021, but I've heard that it's just continued to rise. The first thing to understand is that this is not new, right? Fetishizations, stereotypes, racism against AAPI folks is not new. There's more attention that's been brought to it recently by the wider community because of what happened in Atlanta in 2021, because of what happened in Indianapolis, because of what's been happening in New York with all the Asian women being killed. But it's not something that is, new to COVID. This is something that's happened throughout the history of the United States. It's historical. It's driven by media. It's driven by peers. It's driven by just our collective culture. But it's also reinforced by the state. The othering of AAPI people that has happened again and again in the Japanese internment camps, in the 2017 travel bans to certain countries, reinforces that othering. What it says is that you can be here as long as, in parentheses, as long as you stay as close to the model minority box as possible. But you're not really American. And if there's crisis, if there's uncertainty, then you're the first to go. We can drop you. We can, put you in internment camps or ban travel to your countries. And then the other aspect that's often left out of the conversation is the intersection between not only this racist violence, but also the gendered aspect, the sexualized aspect of it. Kind of similar to what Ayana named in the beginning, misogynoir. There's an intersection between gendered violence and sexualized violence that AAPI women and girls have to contend with on a daily basis. The fetishization again, the stereotype that AAPI women are submissive to their husbands or their partners. So they not only have to contend with violence from outside of their community, but also violence from within their community too, in the norms and the gender expectations that are put upon them from their own communities and from the wider mainstream, so to speak, community. We know that many AAPI folks, elders, women especially, have feared just walking in their own community. We know that Asian elders in cities like San Francisco and New York, they don't want to go to the grocery store anymore because they've seen so many reports of just like an elderly person getting shoved, getting beaten, walking in their own community. And in response, there's been great initiatives like, younger folks kind of walking and escorting older folks throughout the community. But the fact that that's needed at all to make people feel safe, is a problem. And if somebody is afraid to go out of the house in their own community, they're going to be more afraid to seek help, to seek services for their abusive, if they're in an abusive situation, or for their immigration cases and so on. And again, like we talked about before, this all kind of seeps, all of this seeps into somebody's experiences and choices. On the next slide, you're going to see some illustrations or some graphs that show the pervasiveness of the fear that's been, rising in the AA, or I guess these graphs are just from Asian Americans, not Pacific Islander community. The fear of violence, the fear of being attacked on the street, the racism that's been experienced. Yeah, pass it to Ayana or Paula.
Could you go to the next slide?
So what is the role of practitioners and advocates in countering hate and harmful stereotypes? Next slide.
Yeah, so I love this. I don't know the right word for it. I don't know if it's a meme or what, but I'm not a tech savvy, social media savvy millennial by any means, but I love this because I think it speaks to sort of the challenge that advocates have in our language, or even phrasing how we're going to reframe narratives, right? So it says, use caution when describing barriers. Being Black is not a barrier for me. White supremacy is the barrier. Being female is not a barrier for me. Patriarchy is the barrier. Name the systems of power. Those are the barriers. And so I think in terms of, how do you counter a narrative? How do you change the ways in which survivors will be viewed? What role does ethnicity play? What role does culture play in all of these things? I really think that at the root of it, making sure that we're naming what the actual issue is instead of what someone's identity is, because the identity isn't the issue. The relationship with the system is the issue. And so again, if folks are saying, well, she's only having these issues because she's a Black woman, is actually placing the onus on me as a Black woman having experienced violence, versus saying she's having these issues because the system has been set up to devalue Black women, or the system has been set up to be so mainstream that folks aren't getting what they need. And so next slide. And so what's really helpful and what has been helpful to me in my own work is to really think about how do you then apply anti-oppression principles to your work, because survivors do, for the most part, know exactly what they need. They might not know the exact name for it, what that resource is called. But if you're having conversation with folks, they can tell you like what their needs are, what their lived experience has been as well. So some anti-oppression principles to always take into our work: make sure we're avoiding tokenism and correct it when it shows up. I've been in spaces where I had someone in leadership say to me, well, I'm really glad you're here because you're a Black woman and so you can work with other Black clients. And it's like, what are you doing? Like, you should learn how to work with the Black clients too, because what's going to happen when I leave? And more so, if you don't even know how to work with me, you're definitely not working with survivors. White allies, we need you all to step up and show out when other white allies need to be held accountable. Please, again, don't put all of the onus for teaching and expanding and giving grace on people of color. Silence for many equals violence, because it means if you're not being active about addressing a situation or vocal about addressing a situation, then a lot of folks will assume that you're okay with it and you're okay with the status quo being what it is. Really important, do not tone police Black women. Listen fully, listen deeply, listen with an empathetic, with your empathetic side showing. Really make sure, because again, the ways in which Black women are shut down because of our tone is again feeding into white supremacy. It's feeding into anti-Blackness. It's feeding into all of those different tropes that we talked about a little bit earlier. And so we want to make sure that we're allowing folks to show up however they need to present, however they want to present. And then make sure that you are actually applying trauma-informed principles when working with staff as well. Dr. Elise Moore-Orby out in California says, we are the work. Black women, women of color, we are the work, we are the survivors in this work. And so making sure that we have that same framework for understanding. Examine language and the histories behind language. So understand that in many ways, language can be violent. If we look at where, look at the relationship where a lot of Black folks won't say things like picnic and instead will say cookout or barbecue. There's a history behind that. There's a history even with sundown towns. There's a history with carnivals and Black folks and racism. So to understand that language and how that's going to actually like really translate for folks is really important to think about. Set some goals and remain thoughtful about your follow-up. Don't fall into fragility, and when you do, process it and keep going. A lot of folks, when they're first getting into this work, can fall into that fragile space, but staying there is actually one of the things, again, that just reinforces white supremacy, and it doesn't help us move away from it. It doesn't help us get into a social justice framework for our work. Remember that healing is a process, and it's not a linear process. It's not like one day, 2 weeks from now, 3 months from now, you're going to be good. There are a whole bunch of different layers of trauma that someone may have experienced: generational trauma, interpersonal trauma, community trauma, historical trauma, and they can collide and they can show up and have ripple effects that sometimes people don't even know about or don't understand fully, and that's okay. Create space for these conversations and continue to reevaluate if those spaces feel safe and brave, and for who and when. Embrace confrontation. Now, I don't mean like go yell at the person that you work with like in the hallway. That's not what I mean by confrontation. What I mean is to actually be willing to sit and be uncomfortable, or to sit and sit through tension. Like, productive tension is actually a really good thing sometimes. But to just face whatever conversation needs to be had, because a lot of us, we get, really nervous when it comes to talking about race. We get really nervous when it comes to talking about difference. But survivors need us to have these conversations. And if we're not willing to have these conversations internally, then what are we really doing? Is it actually authentic allyship that we're trying to get to or not? And then the last thing, of course, is to change policies and practices. So do an internal audit, do an internal, 360 review, talk to your staff, talk to survivors. Listening sessions go a long way. Surveys go a long way. Asking for feedback goes a long way. And then being able to actually shift policies and practices when they need to be. Next slide.
Paula and Shirley, did you want to weigh in at all on the previous question?
Yes, to what Ayana said, when you're asking staff about their feedback, it is important that you do have the goal and the ability to then shift what comes out of that. Because if you don't, then you lose staff trust and engagement, right? It impacts their vicarious trauma. Attorneys and advocates working with survivors in this with these cases, it is difficult, and we're obviously, you all know that we're going to talk about that. But when you are looking to institute change within the institution, it's really important to have staff buy-in for resiliency and for staff to be heard, right? And so we're going to talk about that when I talk about the trauma-informed practices, but it comes in the organizational level. That if you can't really change, or you need to go to your board to support these changes, then it's best to do that before asking staff for their input. And it's a process.
Thank you. Shirley?
I don't have much to add at this point. I just want to uplift the fact that I love that Ayana and Paula, you both talked about this, not only from a survivor advocate relationship, but also from an organizational perspective. I think it's so important and often overlooked, the fact that a lot of times our movement, our organizations replicate the same types of oppression, the same harms that we're trying to fight against. And so, being anti-oppress, taking an anti-oppression framework doesn't mean stopping at the survivor relationship. It means really embodying that, living that throughout your organizational values, your organizational policies and practices. And it all matters. It's all important.
Thank you. How can practitioners and advocates use an intersectionality framework to serve immigrant survivors of color who are facing COVID-related challenges? Next slide, please.
So intersectionality is one of my favorite things to talk about. I could just talk about it for days and days because it's just so interesting, like what makes people full people, right? So intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. Get to know this theorist, author, writer, amazing work, and is a framework that was designed to explore the dynamics between identities and what she called connected systems of oppression. So for instance, the relationship between race, class, and gender with patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism. So think about and put in the chat how those relationships might have shown up during COVID for different communities, right? So we know that thinking about, who are the first responders, who were the essential workers, who were the people that were able to stay home? What did that look like? Who had access? Even in school, did all children have access to technology? No. So even thinking about what that intersection could look like. And then Audre Lorde says there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Next slide.
Sorry, can I just add one point to Ayana? In terms of intersectionality, I've also heard intersectionality in different ways, and there's some folks that think it's the intersection of identities between privilege and oppression, and it's not. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the phrase to bring light to the realities of multiple oppressions that one individual faces. So we say a woman and then a woman of color, right? Two forms of oppression, right? It could be sexism and it could be racism. And so that those two experiences are piled up, right?
Yeah, I think that's really important, right? So there was this, these two, actually, so let me back up. So and not going to tangent. These two videos were produced by raceforward.org. You can find them on YouTube, and there's a whole series I highly recommend folks watching because it's a great explanation of what intersectionality looks like. So we're gonna watch, I was hoping we get time to watch both of them. They're pretty quick, we can watch them back to back and then unpack it. But they're a great way, again, to Paula's point, to think about those multiple layers of identity, of trauma, of systems interaction, and what that means for somebody's experience. So we'll watch these, and we can feel free to add your comments or your thoughts to the chat as we watch. You might have to switch it to the actual YouTube link.
Okay, my computer's thinking, so I'll open it on YouTube.
Okay. And you're able to add the closed captions as well on YouTube.
I could also share my screen if that would help.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my computer is not wanting to load. Do you mind pulling it up quickly?
Nope, no problem.
Thank you so much.
I think you have to enable your audio from your share screen.
Okay.
Race and sexuality, everything in every way.
You able to hear it?
That I'm negotiating my space and the way that I'm accessing space is in relation to how the United States of America is seeing me as this brown woman, as this foreign, as this migrant, as this person with an accent, as this person who's perceived femme or woman. I can come up here and identify as a white woman, but that is not the reality. Immigrant spaces, we're fighting for immigration rights, getting that DREAM Act or getting that, CIR. Don't talk about, your reproductive rights, or don't talk about your queerness. Doesn't even take into consideration economic class. Doesn't take into consideration how very English-centered it is. How are we fighting for immigration rights and most of your pamphlets are in English? Like, that doesn't make sense. And then in queer spaces, there's been the neglect to acknowledge immigration or even, undocumented statuses. And then in a general sense, my identity and as an artist and a poet, that is always erased in many spaces. We're always doing reactionary work, and we're always doing, fighting against this or fighting against something. But when it comes to artists, we're always left behind. That's one of the reasons many of us turn out, because there's no recognizing of all of our identities and showing up as Hopians and showing up as complicated individuals. In this country, what I've noticed is immigration reform has always been about the access to whiteness. Example, we have two borders. Which border is racialized? Which border is more militarized? Which border exists within racial coded language? That's usually the Mexican border, right? And there's this myth of that there's a border right with Canada. Many movements that are advocating for undocumented communities, they're always leaving out Black migrants. Look at all the campaigns, look at even the posters. There's one sort of depiction of immigration and migrants that is very coded under who is now deemed acceptable to kind of uplift white supremacy or whiteness or a certain identity of citizenship in this country. So, and that's many brown communities. I mean, there's the reason why there's anti-Blackness within migrant spaces and non-Black people of color spaces. There's always going to be a policy that is going to be shifted. But at the core of it, non-white bodies are always going to be seen as quote unquote illegal, or as not having any legality in this country. All of my identities are intertwined. I think that having to negotiate with any of them is not going to take us anywhere to the journey of liberation or radicalness or progressiveness. So what we're actually trying to do, if anything, is the erasure of what has led us here.
Lady Dame Figueroa Aditi, performance artist, goddess, ancient jazz priestess of Mother Africa. Race and gender, race and class. So I'm a Black, Indigenous, Cuban, Nigerian, American woman who's trans. I'm the daughter of an immigrant. I come from the ghettos of Baltimore. People have to understand what all of the histories of all of those identities in order to understand really my positionality within the world. There are poor Black people, there are rich Black people, there are Black cis women, there are Black trans women. And so intersectionality is telling us that we have to discuss race in particular, right? Like, because that's the topic that I'm using. Like, if we're talking about race, that we have to talk about it in its full scope. Yes, we are sharing an experience because, for example, two Black people, we are sharing this experience because we're both Black, but I'm a Black trans woman. And so numbers don't lie. And we all know that Black trans women in particular are some of the most marginalized in our community and the most affected by structural oppression. There's this concept that we are all given the same opportunities, but it's not true. If we look historically and we talk about, you know, this idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, Black people actually did pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But we then have places like Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. There was thriving Black neighborhoods, Black people buying from Black businesses, owning Black businesses, investing in Black businesses. Right? And that's what they're told. All you have to do is be rich and nobody can ever hurt you again. All you have to do is buy into the system and move upward and you'll be safe. What then happened was their white neighbors would then come and literally commit acts of genocide. And so now today, right, we have people who could have had old money who are now poor. And so what is that psychologically saying to these people? That when you thrive, when you succeed, you're still not safe. And so we're talking about race and class, and we're not understanding the history of race and class as it presents itself in America in particular, because that's where we're living, right? And we're having a fool's conversation. If someone comes to me and they say to me, you are creating differences, I would say, no, that's actually not true. Because in my indigenous cultures, people who were different were still essential to society. Within European cultures, particularly within the rise of patriarchy and the way that it manifests through religion, is that differences, little by little, were no longer celebrated and they were stamped out. And the one thing that structural oppression gives us, that we should all aspire to, generally is of a cis, het, white man. So when we're talking about intersectionality, right, I'm always being an intersectional being because I'm all of these things always at once. If you're having a conversation with me and you're not having a conversation understanding that I come with all of those identities within the conversation, then how are we supposed to move forward?
So as we're getting the screen back up, I'm gonna quickly pass it to my colleagues here. But the main point to really emphasize is what Lady Dane ended on, of like, if you're having a conversation with me and you're not understanding all of these different identities, all of these different needs, all of these different traumas I might have experienced, then we really are having a fool's conversation. And so to really make sure you're leaning into the concept of intersectionality, really leaning into thinking about the multiple layers of resources that someone might need, the multiple layers of trauma someone might have experienced. That's why it's important to focus in on difference, to focus in on ethnicity, to remain culturally humble. So let me pass it over.
Shirley or Paula, did either of you have anything you wanted to say about intersectionality?
Nothing at this time. I want to save time as well and leave any questions at the end if folks have them specific to their work.
Sure. So how can practitioners and advocates avoid re-traumatizing their clients, including clients who are experiencing COVID-related trauma? Next slide, please.
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit before, so I won't take up too much more time, but just be aware, as the first bullet says, that often survivors think of advocates as their only support or their only lifeline, especially because there's so much shame and stigma around being a survivor, particularly in AAPI communities, but I think also in other communities as well. In often cases, survivors are made to feel embarrassed for being a survivor of violence, even from one's own family, even from one's own community. And so advocates often have to be the liaison or the conduit between several different systems, child welfare, immigration, social services, and so on. And so that's why it's so important to maintain this relationship of collaboration and trust, to empower survivors to make choices by providing them information, by not prescribing solutions, but just giving them the options, by taking the time to be mindful of trauma, as we talked about before, and how that might impact the survivor, of taking the time to understand the intersectionality and where this person is coming from, the wholeness of their person. And to be aware of their own internal biases. Just because somebody is Korean doesn't mean they want X, or just because somebody is Muslim doesn't mean they want to, Z, X, Y, Z. Each person is individual and each person is different. So understanding cultural dynamics and how they might impact the survivor, but not letting that be a stereotype, or not letting that turn into an assumption. And then for immigrant survivors in particular, there's so much fear of enforcement, deportation. So helping survivors understand their rights, helping survivors understand how the information about them can be shared, or will be shared in their specific locality and with which systems. So in general, just helping them break down the systems, the processes, and demystify all of the rules and regulations that they're a part of, is part of that trust building process. On the next slide, there's a little illustration that was created by Texas Muslim Women's Foundation, which is an organization, direct service organization that we work with. And it really illustrates kind of the mutual relationship, the back and forth relationship between an advocate and a survivor that is at the root of building a trauma-informed, survivor-centered relationship. So for the advocate, that means being aware of how they're communicating, being aware of the trauma triggers, being aware of just how you can help somebody understand and communicate. That's all part of this trauma-informed relationship. Yeah.
Next slide, please. Paul, I think this was you.
This is me. Thank you, Shirley and Ayana. I'm thinking of, all of you sitting at your desks, taking in all of this information and knowing that you then have to educate judges and other individuals in other systems, right? Law enforcement and so forth. And so what I have found that is helpful in training about trauma is the impact of the brain for someone or an institution that wants to be clear cut, right? So there's literally a part in the brain that is impacted, right? Which is the oldest part in the brain is the reptilian brain, where we just think of survival. And the process of the front of the brain, the frontal lobe, that's when we do all of our logistics and planning and so forth. That goes out the window. So the trauma response is fight, flight, freeze, or accommodate, right? The person who's harming you. So how do you, as we've heard today, this intersectionality, these histories of trauma, and how does that impact the individual's behavior, even when it may be maladaptive, is, if I could offer, is really looking at the reality that it's a fact, it's science, right? That the brain, that survivors cannot remember chronologically, and in affidavits how important chronology is. And so just a bit of advice in terms of when trying to teach other folks that may not have the same viewpoint of how to talk about trauma. So I want to talk about now the principles of trauma-informed care. This was created both by the CDC in collaboration with SAMHSA and with the National Center of Trauma-Informed Care. And so this, if you look at the elements that are needed, the principles that are needed with trauma-informed care, again, trauma-informed only, if you think about it, means understanding how the body, how individuals react to trauma. So a traumatic event could be you almost got into a car accident, or you got into a car accident, to the extreme, all of those cases that you're working on, right? And so understanding that, and then when we talk about vicarious trauma, is that it is inevitable for all of us to be able to listen to someone and not be impacted by those stories. It's just not possible that we're not going to be impacted. The way in which we're impacted is different, right? Depending on our histories, depending on our protective factors, our self-care and well-being. And so it is inevitable. So that how do we then work with survivors, work with our clients, and also institute organizational practices that are going to mitigate the impact of vicarious trauma and increase that resilience, right? Of folks to be able to be in this job, right? Instead of burnout or vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is inevitable. Burnout does happen, and it's different. Burnout is really the ability not to bounce back. When I'm done. There's no self-care that is going to make me feel that I can continue. And lots of colleagues that I know have made the choice to leave the field for a while or a different type of law and then come back. So it starts with safety. Is the survivor feeling of safety? Do employees feel safe? Right? So talking about both the client and the employee serving the client. And by that, I mean, is it scary to stay in the office after 6 o'clock because you don't feel safe going to your car? Like your physical space. Is it safe for survivors? Now, safety means very different to me than what would mean to you. And so one of the things that we can do in order to decrease that heightened sense of that hypervigilance, which is a response to trauma. I am up up and I have to be careful and I have to be looking around. And I'm sure you have clients that do that don't want to sit next to the door. So what can we do when we're talking to clients is to say, to explain the process. This is what we're going to do. This is what's going to happen. This is where we're going to meet. This is the person's name, the individual, if someone else is joining you. This is why they're here, all their roles, because there's also paranoia, and rightly so, of experiences of trauma. So safety. Do individuals feel safe as employees and as survivors and clients? Informed consent. Yes. Ayana, do you want to jump in on informed consent?
Oh yeah, what you were just saying is really just reminding me, like, you need to explain what's gonna happen or what potentially could happen before you're like, oh yeah, just go for that protective order, and then you didn't explain all the potential outcomes that they might not have chosen to do that protective order had they known. So it's really just that concept of like, tell people the good and the bad and the unknowns, really every aspect that you could talk through.
Yes, and when you're talking about the bad, also talk about the plan. In the event, and I'm sure you all do that, in the event that this were to happen, this is what we will do. I can't promise you, which brings me to transparency and trustworthiness. I can't promise you this. This has been my experience, something that I'm sure that you all do. Trustworthiness and transparency within organizations, right? Similarly, how we talked about before, if you're asking staff for their feedback, what is the plan of implementation, whatever comes out? If there's a decision made, the understanding, if there's a hierarchy, people can say what they feel about a process and understand that what they say is not necessarily going to be the outcome, but to be transparent about the process and on how decisions are made in the organization. What decisions staff don't have input on, and what decisions do they have input on, because that builds transparency. So transparency with the client and transparency and trustworthiness with employees. And that this is an organizational response. Collaboration, peer support. It is isolating. Like if you've ever been before COVID and you introduce yourself, and let's say in a party or a group of people, and then you tell them what you do. Oh, I work with victims of crime. Oh, and sometimes the conversation stops, right? And so you can't really talk about your work. Who can you talk about your work to? It is isolating working in this field, working with survivors of trauma, and also working with communities that are impacted by oppression, right? And so it is essential for increased resilience to have peer support within the organization and for individuals themselves to identify who can I talk to about my case in the same way that I am seeing this case. My identity, if I share an identity with my client, be it woman, Christian, whatever it may be, it's going to resonate. Some stuff is going to resonate about the case with me, right? And so who are those people? So organizations, is there a space where folks can just gather and not be like forced gathering, right? But just, are there opportunities for folks to have some peer support? I know for COVID, that was really difficult for folks, really losing that time going into the kitchen, talking to people. When I went from, working local, statewide to national, I really missed, knocking on a colleague's door and say, can I talk to you for a minute? Like, oh, I had such a horrible phone call. Right? You could do that, try to do that through Zoom, but to create that the organization supports that individual peer support instead of having fear about what are these two employees doing, talking alone, right? That also happens with a staff of color, right? They may have similar experiences and their totality is understood, and to have those spaces. Collaboration and mutuality, again, imagine the vicarious trauma. Imagine how hard these cases are. Isn't it awesome when you have a team? Like when you have, let's say like for funding, sometimes you don't have enough funding, right? Maybe you're the only attorney in this organization. It's not a legal services. But if you have a team of folks, that makes the work much easier. It's not all on your shoulders, or less hard, I would say. Or you could have funding, but there isn't that collaboration and mutuality. For supervisors, organizations, and folks that are designing programs to talk about or to think about, how is the work shared, that it's not on just one person. I would say this is really important when organizations are trying to increase access and hire the one staff that's going to do that. Like what was said to Ayana, like, oh, I'm so glad you're here. And so to be thinking about, it's not one person's responsibility, it's an organizational responsibility. Empowerment, voice, and choice. Are individuals empowered? Can they say what they want to say about what is happening in community, what is happening in our country, what is happening to survivors, and be able to share that, because that impacts the way in which we do the work. So if our organization supports saying, we feel more strengthened, right? We feel validated, right? There are some people, I've heard that after George Floyd, people went into work and no one talked about it. And literally people couldn't function and couldn't concentrate, but the organization just didn't talk about it because there was fear. There was a fear of an unknown. And as Ayana said, when there's silence, there's violence. It is having those opportunities at work to be able to talk about those social issues that are impacting our clients and impacting our staff. And related to that is the reality of what you've heard today, those cultural, historical, gender issues that happened 200, 300, 500 years ago have an impact, have a linear impact, and we could do a whole training about that, on individuals' experiences today. If you think of just intergenerational wealth, how does enslavement and genocide and colonization impact intergenerational wealth? And that's just one example. So it is important when talking about an individual or supporting that individual in their case, that the organization understands the cultural, historical, gender issues, and also that we're able to talk about that. When Shirley said living in a refugee camp, there are individuals that have gone to 3 refugee camps. And that talk about choice, you don't have a choice. You are told where you're going to go. It's very different than the immigration experience, where an immigrant decides to go. Maybe it's because of violence, or maybe they're fleeing violence, still traumatic, but there's a choice of going and fleeing, as opposed to a refugee going to a refugee camp that they don't know where they're going. And they could have multiple experiences before they come to see you. So this could be a whole training. I'm going to pause here and see if my colleagues want to join.
Thanks, Paula. In the interest of time, I think we'll move on to the next slide. How can practitioners empower their immigrant survivor clients during and after COVID-19? Next slide, please.
Yeah, I don't think I need to say much more, because I think Paula just basically covered my next 2 slides, and that was amazing. And yes to everything that she said. The only things that I'll point out from this slide is just, all of this takes time, right? If the client needs interpretation, that will take time. If they are, you need to be explaining all the choices and all of what could happen if they make these choices and the backup plans, that all takes time. And so it's so important to build in this time to the extent that is possible. I mean, I know everybody has caseloads, and there's never enough time, but as to the extent that's possible, build in the time to help clients understand, to process, to handle trauma if they're feeling re-triggered. Don't just kind of rush through and speed things along. And then secondly, language access, right? Language access should be a priority. It should not be an afterthought. And what I mean by not gatekeeping that is don't just assume that somebody doesn't need language access, doesn't need translation or interpretation just because, you ask them their name and where they come from and they can respond. Just because somebody can communicate basic things in English and they're comfortable doing that does not mean that they can talk about traumatic things that have happened to them. Does not mean that they can talk about legal, complicated immigration related issues in English, or that they're comfortable doing that. And so just being mindful of, they may not know to ask, or they may not be comfortable asking that, but they may be much more comfortable speaking in their language through an interpreter, and not just assume that they don't need an interpreter because they can answer some basic questions in English. On the next slide, I love this reflection that was shared with us from a listening session. It says, when I stopped showing up with a stack of forms, that's when survivors started opening up. It was a hard shift to make as someone with a legal background, but it made all the difference. And just kind of naming that, the difference in relationship and how that can make a survivor feel when you show up and you just you go down the list, what's your name, what's, this and that, versus when you really allow them, when you really take the time to build an open, trauma-informed, mutual relationship with them, that can change the whole nature of the relationship. So yeah, next.
Ayana or Paula, did you want to weigh in quickly?
No.
Okay, next slide, please. So what are the consequences of lack of language access, and why is language access important?
I just quickly want to give an example. I'm not going to read the slide. Obviously, it's a threat that the partner has said to them. Where are you going to go? You're going to call the police. No one's going to believe you. You don't even speak English, so forth. Imagine your websites, your brochures, just blank, right? Because if there's no way to read them, language access is essential. Many years ago, I working in a domestic violence organization. A survivor came in and no one was available there was no advocates available to speak to the survivor. I was a program director. I came to speak to the survivor, and the survivor was a Brazilian woman who's speaking Portuguese. Some will say that there's similarities in Spanish and English. Yes, there are. However, that is insufficient and is dangerous. I could make out by talking to this individual, because I speak Spanish, that her partner had put his hands around her neck. That is an indicator of lethality. It is irresponsible for us not to have language access. I'm going to, in the chat, we have a language access toolkit at Esperanza United. Please go. It is important to have an organizational language access plan. It is essential to have leadership, have a commitment and endorse it in training. And also it's important to have a line item in your budget for language access. So that's all I'll say. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. I put in the link, the language access tool, and it is a process.
And the only thing I'll add quickly to Paula's point and Shirley's is that when you build into your budget, when you build in language access and you build in language resources to your budget, survivors won't feel like they're a burden and they're going to actually use those resources. And you won't be struggling as an advocate trying to figure out what you can do for them because you'll already know it's normal.
You could advance 3 slides, please. Yep.
Yeah, this is my slide. I don't really have much to add that's not already been named, just except to show this slide to say that, again, there's a lot of diversity in terms of the need, and there's a lot of languages that there is need for, even beyond what's on this slide.
And the only thing I'll add, is this needs to be an organizational approach. Everything that we're talking about, it cannot be with one person's responsibility or to have a position that is going to address this. It has to be an organizational commitment, and it has to look at all areas of the organization. How are we looking at issues of culture, issues of oppression?
Were there any final remarks from the panelists? Well, thank you to all of you for your time and your wisdom. This has been very educational for me, and I think it's been very educational for our audience as well. So thank you very much, and thank you to our audience for your participation. The contact information for two of our panelists is in the final 2 slides of the webinar. My email address is kelly@asistahelp.org, and Paula, if you wanted to share yours in case people had questions. Paula, did you want to share your email as well with the attendees? Oh, you put it in the chat.
Yes,
Okay,
we put it
thank
in the
you.
chat, but it's pgomezstordy@esperanzaunited.org.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. That concludes today's webinar. I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for being here, everyone.
Thank you very much. Happy Friday.
Happy
Bye.
Friday.
Mhm.
Friday.